Chapter 2. The Jews of Palestine. Among the Jews we see religion holding a place which strikingly contrasts with that assigned to it among the Romans. In Judea, the religious interest was not subordinate to the civil and secular, as in Rome, but the civil and secular interest was subordinate to the religious. But we need not go so far as the capital of the world to find an illustration of the contrast which the peculiar people offered to all other nations. On the coast, in the immediate neighbourhood, men were occupied with wool and glass and purple, and in the north also the inhabitants were more concerned about the commercial advantages that could be derived from the new Roman unity and organisation than about such questions as agitated the descendants of those to whom God had spoken by the prophets. The burning questions on the sacred soil did not turn on matters of external policy or commerce or political economy, but on matters of religion, though behind them secular interests and civil might also be cherished, and sometimes, especially in the case of the Sadducees, these were not concealed. And though, as was inevitable, the conflicts which arose on the religious territory exerted a powerful influence on the course of the nation's outward history. The two principal parties, as you are aware, were the Pharisees and Sadducees. It is common to speak of them as sects, but more than one writer in recent times has noticed that the application of the term sect to them, as the word is now generally understood, is incorrect, since they did not separate themselves and had no thought of separating themselves from the religious communion of their nation, but considered themselves on both sides to be its truest members and representatives. Equally incorrect is it to speak of the Pharisees as the conservative party in such a sense of the expression as is current among us, and it is scarcely less objectionable to speak of the Sadducees as the rationalistic party, for, generally speaking, they were far from questioning the divine authority or the divine origin of the books which they did receive, viz. The books of Moses, and sometimes adhered more rigidly to the strict interpretation, where the Pharisees' disposition to exercise judgment mildly delivered them, for the time, from the bondage of the letter, as, for instance, in the passage, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," where the former insisted on the strict fulfilment of the words, while the latter thought that pecuniary indemnification might be accepted in atonement for the offence. Neither party can, in the worst sense, be called rationalistic, though the Pharisees may, with some propriety, be termed the orthodox, since, with all their exaggerations and aberrations, they held the national religion in its actual development, and, however erroneous their conceptions of the Messiah, cherished the hope of his advent. If, however, either party is to be called conservative, it is not they, but the Sadducees, who have been with good reason characterized as a priestly aristocracy. This they certainly were when the apostles began to proclaim their crucified and risen Lord. Among the ancestors of the men who formed this conservative party were those of whom they had little reason to be proud, and who had proved apostates and traitors. But still, though not undisputed or uninterrupted, their influence and power were great in the temple, as, on the other hand, the party of the Pharisees, with whom they stood in direct antagonism, ruled the synagogue, and ruled through the synagogue. The derivation of the name Sadducee from the common word meaning righteous is now abandoned by many, though it had this to recommend it, that, however far their personal character might be from corresponding with it, it was at least indicative of their strict adherence to the letter of the law. By many they are believed to have been called from the proper name Zadok, whether the ancestor of the ancient and famous and Levitical family mentioned in Ezekiel 40, verse 46, and in other passages, or from a Zadok who flourished about 2 centuries and a half before Christ, and who was a pupil of Antigonus Socho, who is said to have taught that virtue ought to be cultivated without respect to any recompense of reward, and to have denied the doctrine of retribution in a future life. This doctrine, we know, was denied by the whole party, whether they derived their name from the Zadok of the 3rd century, or, as seems more probable, from the more ancient Zadok spoken of by the prophet. It does not appear to be established that they expressly and openly rejected all the books of the Hebrew canon except the Pentateuch, but if they accepted the others, they must have understood them as harmonizing or explained them so as to make them harmonize with the explicit teaching of the latter. From the books of Moses, which they did revere, and not from later writings, which to us seem to contain plainer proofs, Jesus draws his answer to their perplexing question, as they suppose it to be, concerning the resurrection of the dead. Whose wife shall she be of the 7? The reply was profitable for correction as well as for instruction, charging the Sadducees with want of spiritual understanding in failing to penetrate beneath the surface of the books of which they recognized the divine authority, and so failing to discover the germ of doctrines which were afterwards to be more fully disclosed. Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures or the power of God. The Sadducees, however, were not uniformly true to the principle of accepting the letter and nothing but the letter of Scripture. It is certain that they denied the existence of angels as well as the doctrine of the resurrection. The angelic appearances, accordingly, recorded in the Pentateuch, they must have interpreted not, as the Pharisees and the Jews generally did, literally, but as transient manifestations of God himself, by which, without employing the agency of any intermediate being, he delivered his communications to men. Upon the whole, the influence of the Sadducees, who, if they cannot strictly be designated by the modern name rationalists, yet laid themselves open to the charges of indifferentism and practical infidelity, was not calculated to be beneficial. And as they rejected, along with the traditions of the elders, much that was not only precious in itself, but prized by the people, and their pride, different from that of the Pharisee, was more offensive to the common Jew, their influence was not great, and was the less likely, therefore, to draw down upon their heads the indignant denunciations of him who came to infuse a new religious spirit into the nation. The traditions of the fathers and the prescriptions and exactations of the schools had become so numerous and minute that it was impossible for ordinary men to make themselves acquainted with them, still more to observe them. But what was impossible for the many was undertaken by the few, who, however, were not contemptible from their number, being estimated to have numbered 6,000 at the time of Christ's appearing, when they also commanded greater esteem and admiration as setting themselves to a task which the common man found impractical, but regarded as praiseworthy and well-pleasing to God. As separated from the common men, they bear the name Pharushim, Pharisees. This derivation is hardly questioned now, though some have traced the word to a Hebrew one meaning expounder of the law. The Pharisees took their rise in the Chassidim, the strict party in the time of the Maccabees, which was distinguished by repugnance to everything Hellenic. Of their exaggerations in various directions, and frequently at the sacrifice of the weightier matters of the law, we have numerous examples in the Gospels. The extraordinary strictness with which they performed duties supposed by them to be necessary for the preservation or restoration of legal purity, and the painful extent and minuteness of their observances in this direction, are illustrated by the story of the Pharisee, a priest, who subjected the golden candlestick itself to a lustration after a feast, and thus provoked the scoff of the Sadducees. These men will in the end set themselves to cleanse the sun. The idea was that all the vessels and furniture of the temple should undergo purification after a feast, as possibly pollution might have been contracted from the touch of an unclean person. As this extravagant concern about things merely outward coexisted with the deliberate evasion and subversion of the most sacred moral precepts, as in particular the fifth commandment, we can understand the holy indignation of the words, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also." Of their prayers and fasting, their phylacteries and tithe payment, and all the multitudinous rites and practices by which, to use their own phrase, they set a hedge about the law, a hedge within which the law was really straitened and stunted, not, as they imagined, protected and enriched and blossoming and fructifying to their everlasting glory. On all this it is unnecessary to dwell. But the complaint is sometimes raised, and not without reason, that injustice is done to the Pharisees by the unmitigated and indiscriminating censure and reprobation which many have heaped upon them. They were the patriots of Israel, while the Sadducees were open to foreign influence and, denying a future, sought to make the best of the present world, not only by submitting to the conqueror, but by suing his favour. The Pharisees held fast the idea of Jewish nationality, and though the idea, as they held it, contained much that was false and dangerous, they cherished it and were devoted to it. Reuss reminds us that their fortune and their blood were readily sacrificed to their country when it required them, and when an insurrection offered any chance of success. From their ranks came the heroic phalanx of the Maccabees and their adherents, who struck at the heart of the power of the Seleucidae, and raised anew the flag of liberty on the walls of Zion. Then began the desperate resistance and heroic struggle which renewed the ancient glory of the people of God, extorted the admiration of Rome and Sparta, and led to the recovery of Jerusalem by Judas Maccabeus and the purification of the temple from the traces of idolatry. It was the Pharisees, Rheus reminds us further, who raised incessant embarrassments and obstacles to the government and policy of Herod the Great. It was they who had the courage to defy the Roman Colossus, and who quailed not when its iron club was raised to crush them. Under their influence, he adds, however, the national sentiment ended by becoming a political fanaticism, and found itself incessantly engaged in desperate struggles provoked by an instinctive antipathy, as imprudent as it was indestructible. The political dissolution of the nation was thus in great part hastened, but its very ruin has turned in some sort to the glory of the Pharisees. For if, of all the ancient communities, the Jewish community alone has survived a catastrophe which seemed to bring inevitable annihilation, it is because no other nationality was founded on a basis so solid or so independent of any political form whatever. Whether it be considered glorious in the Pharisees, it may be admitted that they, above all others, were the bearers and representatives of the energetic and passionate national sentiment that, under God and in fulfilment of his prophetic word, has led to the preservation of the Jewish people through so many long centuries and so many cruel persecutions. This strong national sentiment was nourished not merely by the recollection of the past, but also, and still more, by the hopes of the future. The Jewish nation was not only, as the scriptures represented to be, a nation of priests, but, as Philo says, a nation of prophets. They were doubtless, that is to say, the channel of divine revelation to the other nations of the world, but of a revelation which essentially contained exceeding great and precious promises. And here is perhaps the deepest difference between the Pharisees and Sadducees. The latter not only denied the resurrection of the body and the doctrine of rewards and punishments in a future life, but had no ideal goal either on this side or on that side of death. The Pharisees clung to the promises which had animated their forefathers in the struggle with the Syrian. They appear to have delighted particularly in the book of Daniel, which was a legacy all the more precious because of the courage and devotion it had been the means of inspiring in the days of the Maccabees. Such a passage as Daniel 7 verses 9 to 27, which had no meaning or power for the Sadducees, was for them living and vitalizing. Here was a goal set before the Pharisee, at which the Sadducee, who was content with the present and desired no great world catastrophe, might mock, but which, being sought and longed for, was well fitted, we may see something similar in the Mohammedans, to inspire not only with zeal but with fanaticism men whose notion of religion was fundamentally erroneous. And only in this view, only because they took a false view of religion, because the pure spiritual element was wanting or extremely weak, we can charge the Pharisees, as they are so often charged, with a dead formalism. They were not men who went through a routine of duties with no conscious motive or aim. Their formalism, if we speak of them generally, was living and passionate, often furious and fanatical. Dead, however, it was, inasmuch as the true principle of obedience to God was unknown or inoperative. When we speak of a lifeless religion of the Pharisee, we should be careful to make it plain that this is what we mean. Let us again see that we understand and make intelligible what is meant when we speak of the Pharisees in New Testament phraseology as hypocrites. No party has ever given more undeniable evidence of the sincerity and energy of their convictions. Untrue they were, however, to the deep spiritual nature of man. They were self-deceivers, and they were justly termed hypocrites, according to the use of the word current at the time, as offering a show of piety and virtue, while the heart was far from being right with God. The Pharisee was a hypocrite, but he sincerely believed what he said when he prayed thus, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. That Saul of Tarsus was most sincere in his Pharisaism, we have his own repeated testimony, and he who called himself the chief of sinners was not in any wise tempted to paint himself as, in his unconverted state, different from what he had really been. But the admission of the sincerity of the Pharisees, to speak of them generally, does not at all wipe out the reproach of extraordinary and, in our eyes at least, often ridiculous ostentation. The motive for performing their works, with which Jesus himself so often charges them, was constantly present and powerful. It does not follow, however, that they had no other. They trusted that they were commending themselves to God as well as to the people, and in reading the words employed again and again by Jesus, Verily I say unto you, they have their reward, We are not to understand that, in winning the admiration of men, they had all the reward they looked for. They certainly looked for something ulterior and more glorious, but all the reward that could follow works of self-righteousness and vanity. If now it be asked why Jesus assails the Pharisees with such unsparing severity and indignation, we are already prepared in some measure to answer the question. Their religion was not spiritual. They shut their hearts against the great fundamental point of our Lord's teaching, that the kingdom of God does not exist at all unless it begins within the man. Along with this, however, since the religion of the Sadducees was far from being spiritual, it is necessary to keep in view the fact that they were the active and popular party. The influence of the Sadducees, as it has been said, was comparatively slight, and they were not the men to use their power fanatically. But the Pharisees offered the most formidable opposition to the new teacher and his doctrine, an opposition vehement, obstinate, unrelenting, and at length, in the eyes of man, successful. Notwithstanding all this, their zeal and earnestness, their trust and their hopes, quickened and sustained the popular interest in matters of religion, and offered more points of contact for the pure faith than were offered by the cold and lifeless system of their rivals. But, to use the common expression, there were Pharisees and Pharisees, as might be supposed, even if we did not know of the famous schools of Shammai and Hillel. The founders of these schools were contemporaneous and lived shortly before the Advent. The former was strict and harsh, so much so that, as is related of him, he even required that sucklings should be made to keep the fast of the great day of atonement. The latter was so mild that no man could put him out of temper. Once a man tried it for a wager of 400 denarii, but the wager was lost. It has often been related how a foreigner appeared before Shammai and said, "Make me a proselyte, but you must teach me the whole law while I stand on one foot." Shammai was enraged and drove him away. The stranger went to Hillel and addressed to him the same language. The reply was, "I will teach you the law in one word. Do not to your neighbour what you would not have your neighbour do unto you." It can easily be inferred from this that the one would, as was actually the case, interpret and apply the law in a very different spirit from the other. And we ought to remember, in this case, as in others, that the strong language used, and often used justly, of a party is not to be understood as equally applicable to all its members. While the common Jew regarded all other nations as unclean, and while the Pharisees formed a party distinct from the common Jews, though moving in the midst of them and acting constantly and powerfully upon them, the Essenes, the only party who can with propriety be designated a sect, separated themselves from all the world. Bauer, in speaking of the preparation for Christianity on Jewish soil, contents himself with a passing allusion to the two parties who stand so conspicuously before us in the Gospels, but calls attention particularly to the Essenes, who are not mentioned there, and who, if they are there referred to at all, are so only in the way of indirect and obscure allusion. He considers them worthy of special notice because, although Christianity by no means derived its origin from them, it is unmistakable that the religious view of life taken by the Essenes is far more nearly akin to the spirit of primitive Christianity than all that by which we know the Pharisees and Sadducees to have been characterized. Though they put great value on outward acts and usages, their religion had at the same time a far more spiritual character than that of the rest of their countrymen. Their high life task was to elevate themselves above the things of sense. As physicians of souls, such is the meaning of their name, as physicians above all of their own soul, they were disposed to employ every means which seemed fitted to impart to the soul a healthy, vigorous life, and to keep their mind constantly open for the influences and revelations of the higher world. The religiousness or religiosity of the whole people had been deepened and in some degree purified by the captivity of Babylon and subsequent calamities. To the same suffering some have traced the particularly profound religiosity of the Essenes. Thus, Reuss, speaking of Ebionism as the tendency or direction in contradistinction to the sect in which it eventually embodied itself, says, "Bloody wars, an independence stormy and in the end illusory, agitated the country, almost without interruption, during 2 centuries. There were individuals upon whom oppression weighed more heavily than on the body of the nation. Ill-treatment of every kind, religious persecutions, most iniquitous spoliations, burdensome imposts, the miseries of war, the railleries of paganism, the venality of judges, and all the sad train of vexations which accompany a bad government, taught many Jews to seek Jehovah elsewhere than in the courts of the temple, and to speak to him more directly than by the mouth of a priest or by the smoke of his incense. Union and peace with God became the principal thing. The consciousness of this peace was the supreme felicity to which every individual sought to aspire, and the renunciation of all earthly goods was a small price to pay for it. This sentiment, indeed, did not rise to all the purity of true piety. It had much in common with Pharisaism. It was tainted with the same spirit of pride and particularism. The renunciation of the world was not exempt from a certain satisfaction with self, and the contempt of riches was often allied with the hatred of those who possessed them. The endurance of poverty and tribulation came to be regarded by the sufferer as a proof and seal of his personal righteousness and acceptance with God. The traveller, passing from Jerusalem through the desolate region which led down to the Dead Sea, encountered colonists of this sect, whose melancholy bearing and regulated, constrained life made upon him the impression that here a multitude of men who had found experience too heavy a burden were preparing themselves, not for the kingdom of God as the Jews generally conceived of it, but for death. Pliny's description of them is quoted or referred to by almost all historians who notice this sect, standing out as it does, peculiar among the peculiar people. On the western border of that lake dwell the Essenes, at a sufficient distance from the shore to avoid its pestilent effluvia. A race entirely by themselves, and, beyond every other in the world, deserving of wonder. Men living in communion with nature, without wives, without money. Every day their number is replenished by a new troop of settlers, since they are much visited by those whom the reverses of fortune have driven, tired of the world, to that mode of living. Thus happens what might seem incredible, that a community in which no one is born, yet continue to subsist through the lapse of centuries. So fruitful for them is disgust of life in others. There were, however, among the Essenes, as among the Pharisees, some more and some less rigid. In some of their settlements, for example, marriage was permitted, in others it was not. And there were, on the one hand, Essenes who did not associate with their brethren in any settlement, but lived as hermits by solitary mountain streams, where they bathed themselves day and night, and nourished themselves on wild herbs. And, on the other hand, there were friends and adherents of the Essenes scattered through the towns and villages who adopted their principles more or less fully and followed their way of life more or less closely. The novice who came to one of the settlements was required to spend a year in purification and preparation before he was admitted to the common bath. 2 years more had to elapse before he was admitted to the common meal, though in the meantime he was permitted to be present at the worship of God. After his formal admission, it was unlawful for him to partake of food which had not been prepared by an Essene. Even Roman torture could not compel captives of this sect to partake of food prepared by the unclean. A consequence of their mode of life was the community of goods. The great, if not the sole distinction which they recognized was that of clean and unclean, a higher or lower degree of purity. So exalted and just were the notions of man's dignity that the distinction of master and slave was more odious to them than that of rich and poor. The man that set foot on their colonies was a free man. They cultivated the love of truth and inculcated mutual trust, abhorring oaths and tolerating none except, it is said, on the occasion of the admission of new members to their communities, when an oath, as singular as it was solemn, was administered, containing this, among other things, that the names of the angels about to be communicated should never be divulged to the uninitiated. Josephus is given as the authority for this statement, and he undoubtedly uses the word oath, but if we look at the whole passage in the Jewish historian, it does appear very questionable whether the Essenes themselves would have called it by that name, or regarded it as an exception to their principle that a man's yea should be yea, and his nay, nay. We should certainly be inclined to use the word vows. The proselyte, Josephus tells us, takes tremendous oaths that, in the first place, he will exercise piety towards God, and that he will observe justice towards men, and that he will do no harm to anyone, either of his own accord or by the command of others, that he will always hate the wicked and be assistant to the righteous, that he will ever show fidelity to all men, and especially those in authority, and so on, ending with the promise never to reveal names of the angels. All this, we can perceive, is of the nature of a vow, and though Josephus drops the word oath, he does not seem to be conscious of any inconsistency between it and the strong statement which he makes himself in the immediately preceding paragraph, They are the ministers of peace. Whatsoever they say is firmer than an oath, but swearing is avoided by them, and they esteem it worse than perjury. For they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. Their doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul, and their view of the body as its temporary prison, and still more, the Greek dress in which their tenets and peculiarities were naturally presented by Philo and Josephus, have led many to trace a connection between them and the Platonism of Alexandria. But if it be necessary to go beyond the bounds of the Holy Land at all in accounting for their origin, there seems greater probability in the supposition that those peculiar tenets were derived from an Oriental source, and in confirmation of this opinion is adduced their daily custom of turning reverently towards the rising sun and singing to him ancient hymns, purporting that his beams ought not to fall on anything impure. While they employed themselves in agriculture and the breeding of bees and cattle, they devoted themselves very specially to the study of diseases and the art of healing them, and to this circumstance they are thought by some to owe their name, though, as has already been said, it appears rather to be used of the soul. This too, as well as the things mentioned by Josephus, has a part in accounting for their longevity. They are long-lived also, says he, insomuch that many of them live above 100 years, by means of the simplicity of their diet, nay, as I think, by means of the regular course of life they observe also. He refers here to their abstinence from animal food. We may go on with the passage in proof that, as has already been stated, the courage of their opinions was unconquerable. They contemn the miseries of life, he continues, and are above pain by the generosity of their mind. And as for death, if it will be for their glory, they esteem it better than living always. And indeed our war with the Romans gave abundant evidence what great souls they had in their trials, wherein, although they were tortured and distorted, burnt and torn to pieces, and went through all kinds of instruments of torture, that they might be forced either to blaspheme their legislator, or to eat what was forbidden them, yet they could not be made to do either of them, no, nor once to flatter their tormentors, or to shed a tear, but they smiled on their very pains, and laughed those to scorn who inflicted the torments upon them, and resigned up their souls with great alacrity, as expecting to receive them again. We have now mentioned the principal points known of the Essenes, though some writers dwell also on the gift of prophecy which they claim, for which some members of the sect acquired an extraordinary reputation, not only among the people, but at the Jewish court. But the claim is in no wise surprising in men devoted to a life of rigid asceticism. Such persons have frequently cherished the belief that, by the process which enabled them to rise above the gross world of sense to things spiritual and divine, their vision was purged to discern the things that were to come hereafter. Be it with this alleged gift as it may, we cannot but honour the Essenes for their love of truth, their hatred of war and slavery, their fidelity to their convictions, and, though with some reservation, their mutual love and service, carried to such a point that no man counted aught that he possessed to be his own. The question may well be put, where could the gospel preached to the poor find more receptive hearts than among these, the quiet of the land, whose piety contained so much that was akin to Christianity, and especially to Christianity in its first appearance? Much indeed they had that was akin to the gospel, and yet it must be added on the other side that they had much that was utterly alien to it. For not only the spirit of self-righteousness and self-sufficiency, which they had in common with the Pharisees, but their idea of the human body, which to them was a prison and not a temple, and their idea of human life as worthily led only when devoted to contemplation and asceticism in outward separation from the unclean multitude, including the Pharisee who, notwithstanding the sad countenance he wore, drew upon himself from the still more rigid Essene the charge of frivolity. These things were fundamentally at variance with the teaching of the Divine Master, who came to make all things new, and they prove irresistibly, notwithstanding all the points of resemblance that may be unhesitatingly recognised, that Christ's religion was not the offspring, the natural development, of the tenets which these men held, and the manner of life they followed.